The Silverstone weekend has started, and our 2 practice sessions have told us a lot about the top 4 teams and even the bottom ones. It looks like we're going to have a very close battle in qualifying and the race, and we still have some updates to go over with many more pictures of the Haas, talking about the Ferrari specs as well. Mercedes brought some parts, McLaren, and even Red Bull that I'm all going to go over in the beginning, and then we're going to go over the practice sessions as well. This should be a very interesting week with the teams being very close, so stay tuned. If you guys do enjoy the video and you guys are new here, I'd love if you subscribe. It'd mean the world to me. Let's get started with the updates that came here. I covered most of the Haas upgrades yesterday, but just to show you some better pictures and a better understanding of what this side pod concept is. At first, when I looked at it, I thought McLaren. That was definitely my first initial thoughts, but now that I look at it more and I see the undercut that they have in the car, and the way that they've chosen to keep pretty much the same side pod shape as what they had before, but now with that overbite concept, this is more similar to that of the W14. There's less of an undercut in this Haas car than there is in the McLaren. The W14 was pretty similar when it got updated, obviously, in Monaco, so that's why I would more compare it to that. Seems like this is the fastest solution to have on a car. It is this overbite concept. We see it with every team pretty much, with the exception of like Aston Martin and RB and Sauber, but the main top teams do have this overbite concept. They have changed the floor concept with the floor edge. Also, the rear wing edge on the floor was changed to help the flow under the car. And as I was talking about before with the Haas floor and what Xavi has now taken a picture of, shows us how simple that Venturi tunnel system is going into the bottom of that car, but it is an updated version of their floor, and they seem to be pretty quick. We'll go over them a lot more. As for Ferrari, there's 2 different specs in this car. Sainz is running the old spec being Imola, and Leclerc is running the new spec in Spain. I wanted to point these out. It's very little details that you can notice in a picture like this, but if you look right beneath the side pod and floor, there is a bigger gap on Leclerc's car, giving it a bigger undercut in comparison to Sainz. I thought that they would change that Cobra style aerodynamic piece as well, but it's the same on both cars, so pretty much it's just the side pod that's been changed. Maybe something under the floor has been changed as well. That's what I'm assuming, the Imola floor in comparison to the Spain floor. I'll go over the data specifically for these 2 cars and this team because it's important to note where each car is better. It's a great picture showing you from Suzuka to Austria to Silverstone what's kind of changed in this floor concept. You can see the difference between Suzuka to Austria, just the little gap that's been made on that floor edge and the side impact structure area, how they've defined that. They just slightly defined that for Silverstone, very slight modifications. I don't think this is the big package that they were talking about, and I didn't see anything about the diffuser being done, even though that was stated by a lot of news articles. Mercedes does have some modification done to the front wing and rear wing. I've looked at this. It's very hard to tell what has been done here. It might just have to be with the flexibility on the wing, but to be honest, this wing probably flexes the most. At least from what I've seen on onboards, the W15 seems to flex the most out of the top 4 teams. Ferrari the least, by far. And last team, just to talk about them, that have updates, but they're just circuit specific, is McLaren. Just take a look at that beam wing. You might see that variation change from free practice to free practice. They've kept the same one from FP1 and FP2, but being P1 and FP1 and FP2 has probably solidified their option. Let's now talk about FP2 and FP1. FP1 is the less relevant session, so I'm going to go more into FP2, talk about the race pace, what we should expect, which cars look the best, and stability-wise. We did see Ali Behrman back in the Haas car. He has now signed a multi-year contract as a rookie, which is quite impressive, and I'm very happy for him. He definitely deserves this. In other news around the paddock, I'm just going to slightly go over this. They're talking about Daniel Ricciardo going back to Red Bull and Checo getting replaced. Depending on how these next couple of races go, I feel like speculation is always being talked about with that Red Bull seat, and nothing ends up happening and Checo ends up staying. But we'll have to see what's done. This is by reputable people that do cover the sport, but as I said, it's speculation and rumors. The McLaren car, in my opinion, looked the best. It looked the most stable. Red Bull's very close behind. I would say that Max is arguably at the same pace as these McLarens. But then you got some surprises like the Haas finishing in P4. Mercedes was a little bit lower than I expected, but there's more to talk about with them. Ferrari has their tricky moments. Aston Martin seems to have improved with this bit of front wing that they've added. Still, they're a bit far behind from the top 4. Valtteri put in a pretty good lap, and the RBs are pretty slow again. Williams is also pretty far behind, but let's talk about it. First, looking at the DRS delta, because this is going to tell us which cars are going to be fast in the straight And we should assume that this is pretty much what the speeds are going to look like going into qualifying, unless there's rain. But as of right now, rain is not expected for qualifying, it's expected for the race. The fastest teams consist of Haas, Aston Martin, and Sauber. This seems to be an ongoing trend, but I will say this. The Aston Martin has the highest downforce rear wing out of all these teams. They're still tied with the second fastest car. And even without the DRS, there is still a 307. The Haas 311, we saw how small that lower plane is on the wing. It's a very quick car in a straight. It struggles a bit with high speed, but these updates have helped it. The teams that I'm a bit worried about is probably Mercedes and Alpine. Mercedes with a 304 slower than the Alpine in the straight. Seems to be quite draggy. Not sure what's going on with the team right there. Could have to do with fuel load. It's very possible. We also see Red Bull at a 325, who is behind a little bit, but when it comes to the top 4 teams, and you're looking right here, McLaren for some reason isn't in this data sheet, but they're sitting right between Red Bull and Mercedes from what I've seen. They're about a 324 from what I've seen. Looking at long runs, because this is important for our data, McLaren looks the best so far. I would say they're the strongest car at least. They seem to be the most consistent in laps. Max is very close behind. We do know that tire falls off towards the end of the stint for Red Bull. As you can see, Mercedes and Ferrari are not too far behind. I do think the Mercedes still has a little bit more pace. We still have yet to see it from them. They've been very fast in the slow speed corners, but when you get to Maggots and Beckett's, that's kind of where the team is a bit behind. Their downforce is lacking in comparison to McLaren and Red Bull. Red Bull seems to be dominating Sector 2 as of right now. Alonso's race pace actually looks okay, very consistent, a little bit better for the Aston Martin team. They're still a ways away behind, I would say. V-Carb is in a very bad spot, at least from what we've seen in Free Practice 1 and 2. They are using a car that's supposed to be the best of the updates they brought in Spain, and from what they had in the beginning of the season. But I did expect them to struggle here because of those high-speed corners and some of the same characteristics as Spain. Now to note the Ferraris before we go where track dominance is most prominent for each team, the Ferrari car under the hands of Sainz was much faster in high-speed corners, so that Imola spec worked better in high speed. When Leclerc had the car, he was better overall in the laps, so the slow-speed corners like your Sector 1 and those hard braking zones like Sector 3, he did bounce a lot more. That's been the ongoing issue here. When the car is hitting those high speeds, specifically they've talked about that threshold being around 200 kilometers when you're going into a corner, it bounces a lot, and Leclerc was super unstable. There were so many moments where he was trying to catch the car because of that rear end stability going into these high speed corners. It does seem to be adding a little too much downforce and giving them that bouncing issue in the high speed corners. While the Imola spec car is more stable, it's slower, so they got a bit of a dilemma going on, and they are behind. Regardless of what people say, the car is better, but it hasn't improved like a McLaren or a Red Bull for say. Lastly, talking about track dominance, what we're going to see here, because it's FP2, is Lando, Piastri, and Perez. Now, remember, we all know that Max is much quicker than Perez, so if we go off of this, we can also talk about the zones where I do think Max could be quicker. Looking at the first sector, turns 1, 2, 3 going all the way into 4, and honestly, all the way up until we hit Copse Corner, it's McLaren dominated, and it's been that way as well. Mercedes has been very quick here as well. Aston is another team that's been pretty quick, and so has Ferrari. Sector 1 seems to be up in the air for a lot of teams. When we go into Sector 2, Turn 9 was actually very strong for the Aston car, and sometimes the best corner they had, surprisingly enough, maybe because of their high top speed. But looking off these laps, Perez was faster here. I do expect that, and I think if Max was in the car, turns 10, 11, 12, and 13, your Maggots and Beckett's will be quicker under the Red Bull rather than the McLaren. The exit could be up for debate. It could be the Red Bull, it could be the McLaren. Looking here, Oscar and Lando go back and forth between this. In turn 15, going into Stowe, that's where Piastri had a better part of the lap. Lando was 3/10 on Oscar, so he must have gained a lot of time through Sector 1, maybe even the Maggots and Beckett section through the beginning of it and a better exit. And also depending on ERS usage. Going into the last part of the lap, Lando has a better braking zone, 16 and 17. Perez finishes out the lap better. It's going to be very close between these two teams. I also expect Mercedes to be somewhere in that run with Lewis specifically. This track does suit his late braking style because the later you brake in a lot of these corners, like your turn 3, like your turn 16, helps you gain a lot of pace in comparison to a lot of other tracks. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and let me know your thoughts down below. What do you think? Is it closer than it seems? I do think we have a 4-team battle. Ferrari seems to be the slowest out of the 4. Then I'd say Mercedes, then I'd say Red Bull, then I'd say McLaren. I'd love to hear your thoughts. drop them down in the comments below. Please leave a like, subscribe. It would mean the world. And peace.